have security if you don't have privacy, and vice versa. One of the statements, I think, which Jhalak might remember, was Paul Nemitz in our last discussion said, "This is fundamental to democracy. If two citizens can't have a confidential conversation, you can't actually have a functioning democracy."
Hi, I'm Jhalak,
Hi, I'm Aishwarya.
and welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast. Hi, Robin. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be recording this podcast with you. So, Robin, I'll give you the opportunity to introduce yourself and the work that you do to our audience.
Sure, thank you, Jhalak, and it's a pleasure to be working with you again. All right, so I'm the director of Internet Trust at the Internet Society. I've been in the IT industry a worryingly long time, so since about 1984, and the resonance of that year has proved to be entirely relevant in much of my work. So I spent about 30 years in the IT industry itself, working for companies like IBM and Sun Microsystems and Gartner Group. And most of that was on things like banking systems, digital identity, encryption, and then online privacy and so forth. For the last 12 and a half years, I've been at the Internet Society, where my technical expertise has been repurposed in a way to support advocacy work in support of a global, secure, and trustworthy internet. So that's a little bit of background from me. I mean, technically, as I say, I've done banking systems, encryption, public key infrastructure. More recently, for the Internet Society, I've had to look at the impact of quantum computing potentially on encryption systems. So it's always a fascinating job, and then the never-ending task is to translate between technologists and policymakers because they speak completely different languages.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, and that's a really long and distinguished career. And I'm sure you'll bring a depth of insight for our audiences today. So, in your role as director of Internet Trust at ISOC, I know you've been driving some really important work on building a trustworthy internet. And a lot of our listeners are, of course, interested and engaged in the way policy related to internet is developing. But at the same time, it may be good to hear from you, given where you sit in the ecosystem. What do you think some of the most important issues related to building a trustworthy internet our listeners should be thinking about?
Thank you. Well, I think the first point is to put the trustworthiness in context, and I've been thinking about this. I think since it's the Internet Society and we're talking about computers, I'm going to structure my reply in a binary way. Right. So with binary, you start with 1, then you have 2, then you have 4. Okay. So the way I'm going to use that is the Internet Society has a single driving mission, which is that the internet is for everyone. We have 2 things we base that on, which is access and trust. Because if someone can't access the internet at all, then they can't easily benefit from it. If they can access it, but they can't trust the things that they find on the internet, then again, they're not getting the full benefit. So the 2 pillars under that are access and trust. Then with 4 things that we think make those possible. And that is the internet should be open. It shouldn't be closed off. It shouldn't be fragmented. It shouldn't be controlled by a subset of parties or governments. It should be open, both technically and socially, essentially. It should be global. Again, if it's not global, it's not reaching everyone. And also there's a risk that it's fragmented and that therefore different people's experience or what they're able to experience through the internet is not the same as everyone else's. And so then you're not getting the same benefits. It takes away equality of opportunity. So globally connected is important. Secure, because if it's not secure, all kinds of things can go wrong, fairly clear. And then trustworthy, as I say, if people can get online, but there are elements of their experience that aren't trustworthy, then the benefits of the whole system are eroded. And it's not just, can you trust the information you find when you go online? It's also, can you trust the things that stand between you and that information or those services? And I think what we're starting to realize is that because everything we do online is mediated, it all passes through at least one third party, and usually inescapably many third parties, that actually we have to understand why it is that you can trust or not trust those intermediaries. And so to give you an example, the intermediaries people are probably thinking of first are their ISP and their mobile carrier. And okay, yes, everything you communicate goes through them. But also think about this: the device that you use to access the internet is mediating between you and what you find. Your mobile device, your laptop. And that means that if you can't trust the integrity of that device, then again, you can't necessarily trust the things that you're experiencing online. And this is of particular relevance today in the encryption debate about encryption policy, because of a thing called client-side scanning. What this is a proposal by multiple governments to say, we're having more difficulty getting at people's communications because increasingly they're encrypted from one end to the other. And this is frustrating us because we can't read their communication, we can't listen in on their conversations. And so what we want to do to prevent bad content and bad conversations is we just want to check them on your device before they're communicated. And so that's what client-side scanning is. And as one Dutch newspaper put it really nicely, I think, this is government saying, it's okay, we're not steaming open your letters when they're at the post office. We're watching over your shoulder as you write them in the first place. So this should not reassure us. It's not better. But that's a policy direction. And so that's how that feeds into this whole question of how do you trust a system which is so intermediated? Think of all the things that are between you and a website you visit, or between you and a service that you use, and you're having to trust all of those things. If any one of them is fundamentally untrustworthy, then it becomes very difficult to trust your internet experience as a whole.
This leads very nicely, I guess, into a couple of questions that we had on encryption for you as well. So one of the things that this is the main conversation. I think it's always presented as a binary, or typically presented as a binary, about public trust on one side, lawmakers especially access to investigation, etc., and content on one side, and the other being privacy seen as like sort of its own value. I guess my question would be, so usually when you hear about encryption and when you speak to technical folks, the idea is that it's very binary. So either you do have end-to-end encryption or you don't. And when you talk to, and this may be something that you can draw from in terms of translating technical stuff to maybe policy audiences. Whereas again, when you talk to judges, when you talk to policymakers, when you talk to anyone who's actually in a decision-making capacity, I think the idea always tends to be, you can keep end-to-end encryption, but how about you give us like a little bit of access when we really need it in the context of, child sexual abuse material, law enforcement access in different like kind of contexts. So I guess we wanted to get your thoughts on whether you think that binary exists or whether there are ways we can sort of, I don't know, nudge the technical aspects of, I guess, what end-to-end encryption is.
Yeah. This is a multi-dimensional problem. That's part of the issue. But I think so. One way that I think about it, and it's not my idea. It was phrased this way by a dear colleague who's no longer with us, Joe Aladeff, who used to work at Oracle Systems, and he said in a policy forum, you keep framing this as a balance between privacy and security, and it's not. You have to optimize for both, which I thought was a really good perspective on it. That actually, if you're aiming to prioritize one of those over the other one, you're going to get it wrong. And it doesn't make them easy to reconcile, but you have to set out with the goal of reconciling them, not trading one off against the other. think when this comes to law enforcement, and there are plenty of other people who've said that you can't have security if you don't have privacy, and vice versa. One of the statements, I think, which Jhalak might remember, was Paul Nemitz in our last discussion said, "This is fundamental to democracy. If two citizens can't have a confidential conversation, you can't actually have a functioning democracy." So that's how serious this is. This is child abuse, yes, is a serious problem. So is criminal activity. But actually, the defences against those are really democracy, not purely law enforcement. So that's kind of the policy framing I would like to see. But then, looking at the practicalities, I want to ask you an impertinent question, which is, do you encrypt your emails?
If that was a question to me, I tried and then I gave up pretty quickly, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, and yes, I've been trying to encrypt my emails with greater or lesser success for the last 40 years or so. I'm frustrated by that too. But the reason I ask it is, think about the stated justifications for these policies about law enforcement access to communication. And the top three basically are terrorism, organized crime, and child abuse. And most recently, child abuse has been the dominant one of those. After 9/11, terrorism was the dominant reason, and so on. At various stages, organized crime in the form of drugs or people trafficking has been top of the list. But currently, persistently, child abuse is put at the top of the list. And the reason I sketch out those three is A, because they are the most common justifications for law enforcement access policies, most common put forward anyway. But B, just to make the point, none of those things started with the internet. None of those forms of criminal activity only happen because you have digital technology. The internet and digital technology are at most an amplifier of things that actually originate in social behavior. And so the question, I think, for law enforcement is, are you intent on addressing the symptoms of those forms of criminal activity, or are you also doing things to address the root causes? And to my mind, pressing for law enforcement access to encrypted communications is far more of a measure targeted at the symptoms than at the root cause. And I don't think you can solve societal problems like terrorism, organized crime, child abuse by throwing a technical solution at it. I think you have to do things to address the societal root causes, and that's actually far more important than hoping that technology will bail you out. But thinking then about what technology is proposed, we're kind of told that if law enforcement access to encrypted communications was possible, then these crimes would be solvable. And I'm not sure that's the case. I think it needs to be questioned, because think of the information about your daily life that is held by third parties and is available to third parties, including law enforcement, without you intentionally disclosing anything. And that's why I asked about email. Pretty much everyone's email is unencrypted, with the exception of a few people who use specific end-to-end encrypted email services. But they are the tiny minority. So the vast majority of email is unencrypted. Web traffic, all accessible at the web server, down to the level of the page that you're visiting, obviously. To the extent that in some UK law, the government was forced to say, oh, we're not going to collect which page you go to, we're going to stop at the .com or .co.uk. So we know that you went to Alcoholics Anonymous, but we have no idea why you went there because we don't know which page you visited. Yeah, I mean, that's how good that argument is. So email, unencrypted, web traffic, unencrypted, mobile traffic, accessible at the third party, accessible at the carrier. Your mobile location, is accessible. Obviously, the mobile provider knows which cell you're in, and it's well documented that law enforcement also have access to location data through your mobile provider. Vehicle data, where your car is. If your car's got built-in satellite navigation or mobile communication, then it's exactly as trackable as your mobile device. Of course, it will also show up on automatic number plate recognition systems, ANPR. And so your progress in a car can be tracked by third parties and then again by law enforcement. CCTV. All our urban areas are blanketed with CCTV. Much of it owned and controlled by private companies, very seldom with any kind of visible privacy policy or accountability mechanisms, but also available to law enforcement on request. And one last one that folks may not have thought about, domestic energy consumption. If you've got a smart meter, your energy provider not only knows how much energy that you use, but from the profile of your usage, they can tell things like how many people occupy the house, how many of them are working as opposed to at home, and what kind of dishwasher you've got, or washing machine, because they use they have a very specific profile of energy usage when they're heating water, when they're not heating water, and so on. Now, that's a pretty long list of just some of the information that is available to third parties. And the reason why I introduce that is now think about how intrusive a law would have to have been 10, 20, 30 years ago in order for law enforcement to collect that kind of information about you. And yet now, that information is generated just as a matter of routine by us going about our daily business. And all of it, in principle, can be made available to law enforcement before you even think about the content of encrypted conversations. So, again, I'm going to quote someone else who put this much better than I did. When law enforcement said, encrypted communications mean that we're going dark. We can't tell what criminals are doing because they're doing it inside this black box. And the person in question responded that if law enforcement can't see, it's not because criminals are in the dark, it's because law enforcement are staring into the sun. They have so much information accessible to them that actually they often can't make sensible or productive use of it. And so, it's a problem of surfeit of information, not paucity, not insufficient information.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, maybe the answer to that technical question is more binary, but it does sound like you're saying we should maybe explore like the assumptions behind that, behind the issue of posing something as either you have encryption or you have, I guess, online trust, and instead go one level lower, if I'm understanding, to restate what you said, like very briefly, if that makes sense.
I think so, and apologies. Yeah, I know I go on, and it's
Oh,
necessary.
no, that's very good. Like, obviously, what we're here for.
I did a brief.
No, of course.
But I think so. Law enforcement are always going to ask for more information and better tools because they've got a job to do, and that's what we do. I ask for more information and better tools to do my job, and that's okay. But the decision about whether law enforcement should have that access and that information or not is not for them to make. It's for policymakers. That's a democratic decision to make, not a law enforcement decision. So I think when law enforcement ask for more access and more data, they should also need to be more open about the massive increase in data that they happen not to have mentioned. All of those things that I mentioned, email, mobile traffic, location, CCTV, ANPR, domestic energy consumption, payments, all of those things simply weren't accessible to law enforcement a very short time ago, 2 or 3 decades. And yet now they are. And even in that context, law enforcement is saying, we don't have enough information, we can't see this stuff. And I think that needs to be challenged, because I think there is a lot that could be done with the mass of information that is available to law enforcement before you even need to start considering what you do about confidential communication.
This contextual understanding is really useful, Robin. Last week, in fact, in India, WhatsApp and its parent company Facebook, had their hearing before the Delhi High Court, where in 2021 they challenged the information technology rules, and more specifically Rule 42, that requires social media intermediaries to trace chats and make provisions to identify the first originator of information. And what many of these platforms are claiming is that the only way for them to enable the first originator of information is if they break end-to-end encryption. And what's interesting is, last week in court before the judges, WhatsApp did sort of state its intent that if it is asked to break end-to-end encryption, and if the criminal liabilities with not meeting the legal requirements continues, they will consider leaving India as a market. I know the Online Safety Act in the UK has provisions that impact end-to-end encryption. Concurrently in the UK, we've also seen the Investigative Powers Act come in, which gives fairly broad powers to law enforcement agencies. Um, so we seem to, and all of this comes in the background of some of the world's largest democracies, issuing a statement a few years ago collectively saying that there may be a need to break end-to-end encryption to deal with many of the issues you articulated: child safety, abuse, child abuse, terrorism, other national security concerns. So what do you think of this global trend? And I guess the other question that sort of comes up in these discussions is there's a lot of metadata that platforms can still make available to investigative agencies, which may give them contextually useful information as part of their investigations, which is what law enforcement agencies are really saying is when there's spread of misinformation, there's spread of harmful content, which results in offline real world violence. We need to be able to track perpetrators. We need to be able to pin down how this real world harm came about. So if you have to break down for our audience, from a more technical perspective, is what this kind of metadata may or may not be able to really reveal for investigative agencies, and where perhaps we need to draw the line, and how do we sort of take care of concerns that governments may in some instances legitimately have, and how do we move forward in an increasingly complex sort of legislative space?
Yeah, yeah. No, these are tough ones. You're not taking it easy on me. um, so um, the Indian traceability proposals, as you say, are now a few years old and have been kicked around a bit. I think one of the issues, so there was a proposal at one point to say, actually, we can establish whether someone has sent the same encrypted message um, as the one that we want to use in evidence. But I think there's a fundamental problem there. If I've got a box here and it's got something in it which I can't show you. I've got another box here which has got the same thing in it, but I can't show you that either. But I can tell you that they're the same. All right. So I've got two encrypted messages. And actually, in the case of the encrypted messages, I can show them both to you. And you can say, look, there you go. There's two strings of bits and they are identical. Well, that's okay. But how do you then prove that those strings of encrypted bits are the same as the offensive message that you're trying to prosecute? And so there's a sort of evidential failure here that makes it very difficult to say, okay, you've established that these two binary strings are the same, But now you've got to somehow link them to the clear text message that you're showing me, because obviously the encrypted ones, you can't tell if they're offensive or not. so, so it's not just a matter of saying, oh well, this message came from that person, and in its encrypted form. You've also got to have a reliable evidential way of saying not only that, but if you decrypt this string, it turns into this offensive message. And that's one of the practical problems with the traceability proposals, at least as they were when they were first brought out. So there's another practical problem, which is how many jurisdictions do you want this to work in? Because if what you find is that the person who originated the message is actually in another country, how many law enforcement agencies are going to have the capacity or indeed the inclination to follow that trail beyond their own borders? And the answer is probably none. Most law enforcement agencies complain that they're underfunded anyway to do domestic stuff, let alone to follow things into another jurisdiction. So there are problems there. There are also problems with cross-border legislation, because the law in the country that it came from might not be the same as the law that you're trying to prosecute it under. I guess an example would be, for example, a cartoon or an image that is offensive for religious reasons in one country but is completely uncontroversial in another country. And by the way, the same principle applies to pornography. What constitutes pornography depends on which country you're in. I've seen advertisements in the windows of pharmacies in Germany and France, which in Saudi Arabia would be considered pornographic, because they showed a naked backside. And so the cross-border issues of enforcement here are also extremely difficult to resolve. Thinking about the Online Safety Act, because you mentioned that as a law that has an impact on encryption. The amazing thing is the Online Safety Act doesn't actually mention encryption. Well, it does. It mentions it once. It says if you as a data controller are given a warrant to hand over information, and before handing it over to the police, you encrypt it so that the police can't read it, then you're committing an offence. That's the only thing it says about encryption. It doesn't say anything about you shall not allow people to encrypt stuff. And I think the reason for that is that over the last 10 years or so, governments have realised that actually that argument doesn't work. They've lost it. Telling intermediaries you must not allow people to encrypt stuff doesn't work. They've lost that argument in the public domain, as to my mind. And so they're looking at other ways to do it. And so the Online Safety Act doesn't say anything about encrypted communications. It simply says if someone's doing something illegal and it passes through your hands, you've got to have the means to detect and report that. And if not, you'll be liable. So it's a way to shift the argument away from access, away from we need to break or undermine encryption, to we're not even talking about encryption. You've just got a responsibility to detect illegal content. Who could possibly argue with that? And of course, superficially that sounds rational, but actually, if you look at the implications of all those intermediaries being able to access, detect illegal content, the implications are serious and fundamental, and they attack human rights and other societal values. So it's a bit of a disingenuous way of framing it. And as I say, my interpretation is that governments are taking that tack because they realise they've lost the argument about backdoored or flawed encryption. And that's also partly the reason why there's now a push to scan the content before it gets encrypted at all.
So I think, Robin, that's really useful to understand the way OSA has sort of brought in this very veiled interaction with encryption, and in many ways that's what we've seen happen in the 2021 guidelines in India as well, where there's no explicit reference to encryption. It just says that there's an obligation on intermediaries to be able to track and disclose the first originator of a particular piece of information or message. Um, a more recent legislation that's been debated and brought in the UK is the Investigative Powers Act, and how does that engage with the idea of encryption?
Yeah, yes, that's a good one. As you say, the Online Safety Act raised one set of concerns for civil liberties and private communication, and hot on the heels of it, almost with, I would say, indecent haste, comes came a proposal to amend the existing Investigatory Powers Act. So that's an act that came in 2016, and it's to do with the government's ability to insist that communication service providers build in the means of access if those means don't exist. So even in 2016, this was considered by civil society in the UK to be an extreme set of powers. And for example, Privacy International produced some very good research reports setting out what the concerns were. But fast forward 8 years, the government thinks that even those powers aren't enough, and it wants more. So it introduced a consultation exercise last September, while everyone was still reeling from the after effects of their holidays and the backlog of work that had piled up in the meantime. A consultation on what they insisted were not new powers in the Investigatory Powers Act, but actually they were. And to give you, I think, the clearest example, the amendments they were proposing allowed the UK to insist that a communications provider notify the government in advance if it's planning to make changes to its products or services, and those changes might impact the current ability for law enforcement to access data. So you've got for example, you've got a messaging product that is out there, and perhaps you become aware as the developer of that messaging product that there's a bug in it. So obviously, for your users, you want and need to fix that bug. Well, if law enforcement in the UK had been exploiting that bug in order to crack people's communications, then you'd be under an obligation to tell the Secretary of State. In fact, you'd be under an obligation whether you knew that or not, because you're changing a security function. So you tell the Secretary of State, look, we found this bug, we're going to have to plug that hole, so we're going to change the product. And the Secretary of State can look at that and say, well, I disagree, because that's going to be inconvenient for us. So I don't want you to put that change in. Well, as the technology provider, you do, under the amended Act, have the right to appeal against that decision. Okay, so you say, well, look, we think that's unreasonable, we really need to change the product, so we're appealing against your decision. The person who reviews that decision is the Secretary of State who made it in the first place. And there is no timetable in the bill, there's no time limit on how long the Secretary of State has to take to make that decision, to decide on that appeal. And while that appeal is being considered, you as the service provider are not allowed to change the product. You must maintain the status quo. So all the Secretary of State has to do is park that thing neatly in the in tray and get on with their day job. And you as the service provider are now basically forbidden in perpetuity from updating your product. Now, I used the example of you having discovered a bug, but it might equally be that you've decided to add end-to-end encryption to a messaging service that wasn't end-to-end encrypted before, like Facebook Messenger, for example. So that's a pretty clear example where Meta now, under the IPA amended, would have to notify the Secretary of State that they intend to add end-to-end encryption to Messenger. Secretary of State would almost certainly object, because that will make a number of messages go invisible. And if matter appeal, there is no timetable within which the Secretary of State has to agree or refuse that appeal. So this has a direct and profound effect on the security of online services and products, because it gives the UK unilaterally the ability to refuse security upgrades to products that are used by people in the UK. So it's not a reassuring picture, because the UK, it could be about to make itself the weak link in that global trustworthy internet that I mentioned at the outset.
That's really interesting. I'm curious what the reaction of UK Parliament was when this proposed law was brought before them. And I know civil society in the UK has criticized the parliamentary process that got followed in the context of debating and discussing this law. So yeah, it would be really interesting to hear your perspective on that.
Well, one parliamentary reaction, particularly to the civil society objections, was simply to say, "Oh well, we know that's what the bill says, but we would never use it that way." Okay, well, if you don't intend to use it that way, please put that on the face of the bill, because that's where we'd like to see it. We don't want to have to rely on your informal word that you won't use it that way, because we've been burned by that one before. So I didn't find that compelling at all. Parliamentarians, I think, in general, didn't really find the bill as objectionable as we did. I think they are swayed by the law enforcement argument, and they're perhaps swayed by the argument based on child abuse, because that, in my experience, has tended to toxify the debate. If you stand up and defend end-to-end encrypted communications, it's too easy to be portrayed as someone who is enabling and even supporting child abuse. And I think many members of Parliament are reluctant to stand up in that way, which I think is a shame, because I think, as we discussed at the outset, I think the debate is and needs to be broader than that. In terms of shortfall in the process, I said that I thought it had been done with indecent haste. The bill, the amendments to the Investigatory Powers Act were pushed through so fast that by the time they were debated in the Lords, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission in the UK hadn't had time to produce its report on the human rights impact of the bill. So the debates on the bill took place without that impact assessment, which I think is a serious concern. And I know that there are some civil society organisations in the UK that are contemplating a legal challenge to the bill on that basis.
Thanks, Robin. If we could step back, maybe away from encryption a little bit and more specifically on trust. So one of the things that you brought up when we were discussing, I think, the binary between whether or not encryption is a yes or a no, is you spoke about the importance of so when we think about internet trust, one part of it is the state and is law enforcement, and is essentially how we enable trust in the context of access to data. I think the other, which is also coming under scrutiny a fair bit now, is of the platforms themselves. So as users, how do you trust platforms in different contexts? And I think what you were saying about essentially addressing the root cause of online harms being maybe a better way to actually address those harms instead of targeting the symptoms. Sometimes that messaging has been used by platforms when they're faced with like marginalized or vulnerable communities, essentially trying to get redressal, either because of specific events or on a larger scale in terms of like individual oversight or grievance redressal. So I'm just curious about whether, and also sometimes it is used by state actors, for example, to say that, listen, since you're not protecting the rights of children, since you're not protecting the rights of women, for example, you need to have higher liability under different laws. So I guess I'm just curious about how you think about like, I guess, platform liability in the context of this kind of overall debate in terms of like how you enhance trust while also sort of trying to maintain a balance between security and privacy.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. And again, that's a really hard one because it is right at the cutting edge of the interface between, well, three things really. First, the technology, because that's how so many of these communities are now able to coalesce and represent their interests in a way that they perhaps wouldn't have been able to do even 20, 30 years ago. And that has been enormously beneficial as a vehicle for social change. So there's the technology bringing people together, the policy aspects of it, as you say. If it's a community whose coalescing is of benefit, good. If it's I don't know, a politically extreme group that is coalescing and using the same platform, then you've got a different question to answer. But then the third one, I think, is the economic factor. And I think that often drives the platform behavior. We've seen consolidation onto a relatively small number of extremely large-scale platforms, and there's no doubt that actually that creates what I think of as a sort of gravity well that it's quite hard to escape from. If you're on a platform and so is everyone else you know, even if that platform becomes toxic, it's actually quite hard to simply shift to another one and derive the same benefits because of that gravity effect. I think also something that I think of in terms of the internet and its benefits is the internet makes things like decentralized services possible, but it doesn't make them inevitable. It makes community participation possible, but it doesn't make it inevitable. And so we have to constantly keep defending these things because the economic factors, the economic impetus will always be towards consolidation, towards a way of making money that monetizes the data of masses of people, not just a few people, and therefore gives platforms an incentive to create that gravity well, to attract critical mass. And so I think that we constantly have to be thinking, how can we maximize the potential benefit of the internet for decentralized systems, for peer-to-peer communication, for community engagement, in the face of those policy and economic pressures which tend to make things consolidate and coalesce. And I guess, the economists will say that in some instances, that degree of consolidation is actually a market failure. And a lot of economists will say, when you've got market failure of that kind, actually regulation is the appropriate intervention. But that regulatory intervention needs to be very well informed, and it needs to be based on a clear understanding of what the technology can and can't do. And again, coming back to a point I made earlier, not an assumption that a technical fix to consolidation can actually solve the economic and political issues, because it can't. Those things have to be solved themselves, not by throwing a technical widget at it.
Yeah, I think what you were just saying about especially decentralization and shifting to different platforms, for example, was just reminding me of how hard I found it at one point. There was this conversation a few years ago, I think, in India around shifting away from WhatsApp because I think they'd introduced some changes to their terms of service. It took a really long time for me to convince my friends to maybe move to Signal for a bit, and then we were all back on WhatsApp for like 3 days because they were just like, this is not working for me. So I think the pull of, I think, the centralized platforms very much exists, because even, for example, in the conversation around Twitter or X right now, where people are trying to use Mastodon or Blue Sky or other more decentralized models of social media, I think you're seeing often on X, ironically, that they're not finding a replacement for the platform that it used to be a couple of years ago. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity even for, I guess, new players who want to step into the space, who are able to do a better job of balancing user empowerment concerns, I guess, with their own profit and other sort of like considerations. Um,
Yeah,
if you
I,
were to
I
like
think
stick,
that's
sorry, yeah,
mm, I think that's a really good direction for people to be looking in.
yeah, I
But
mean,
as you say, if you look at, for example, Mastodon or Signal, the economic model for those products is fundamentally different.
yes,
It won't necessarily attract millions of advertising revenue, for example. It won't necessarily generate millions of data monetization. Um, and so you've got to find a different rationale for it. We actually, I did take part in a research project with one of the universities in the UK at Nottingham that specifically looked at WhatsApp usage in Zimbabwe as a comparison with the use of the same product in the UK. And one thing they found was, well, usage patterns are very different. And people in Zimbabwe used WhatsApp a huge amount more and for different things to the way it was used in the UK. So it was not at all unusual for people to be running their business or doing their online banking with WhatsApp, whereas in the UK, I think that would be quite unusual. And so if you ask the question, why is WhatsApp so popular in Zimbabwe? The answer would probably not be because it's end-to-end encrypted. It would be because it lets me do a whole bunch of things that I couldn't do otherwise or couldn't do securely. Okay, but if you ask the question, why is end-to-end encryption in WhatsApp important? You'd get a different answer. It wouldn't be, oh, because it lets me do all my, it would be because it keeps my money safe or because it keeps me safe. And so the reason why WhatsApp is adopted is not necessarily the reason why encryption in WhatsApp is important. And if you asked most of those people why they use WhatsApp, very few of them said, I use it because it's end-to-end encrypted. They almost all said, I use it because it opens up these products and services to me. But both those questions need to be answered. And if you say, it would be fine to remove the end-to-end encryption from WhatsApp because that's not the reason why people say they use it, you would actually, of course, be destroying the value of most of the reasons why they do use it. So they are linked. Both questions need to be asked. Otherwise, you end up with policies that, to use the English expression, throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, you do one thing and it has a far worse consequence.
I mean, just listening to you speak, I guess I was just curious. So, at the center, we've also been doing some work around exploring, I guess, more decentralized models as a way to address platform harm. In the kind of thinking that you've been doing and in your experience, have you come across any? Because the core issue does seem to be monetization. So, why are people going to pay you um, for something on which you will, by design, have fewer folks on each of the platforms? I'm calling them platforms, but however you want to think about that, and how will you pay for content moderation, for any of the other many things that have to happen on it. So I'm just curious about if you had any thoughts on how monetization or advertising or however that looks might work.
I like to try and live my principles. And I mean, we talked about email encryption. I've been beating my head against that one for years. I am actually missing out on quite a lot of family gossip because I, like others, withdrew from WhatsApp in favor of using Signal. And not all of my family, not all of my extended family followed me. But then I'm actually quite an unsociable person. I'm an unsociable person, and therefore I'm actually willing to pay for a platform that connects me to the select few to whom I wish to be connected. But I know that I'm unusual in that respect. I mean, another thing that I've done in order to try and live my principles is I've got my own cloud in the house. So I've got a server that runs an open cloud server. And so within the house, on my local network, I can upload and share my photographs, upload and share music, have shared recipes, have shared notes. And I know that's taking it somewhat to extremes, but it means that I'm not dependent on third parties to host my data, potentially to monetize my data, scan my recipes, work out what my food preferences are, use that to infer my income bracket, how many people are in my household. It's all incredibly revealing data, and I am just happier if it's on that box right there, not somewhere in the cloud on someone else's computer.
So what I'm hearing is that you're encouraging everyone to set up their own, I guess, like local hosting cloud services to the extent that it's possible.
I'm conflicted. I'm conflicted because I don't know what the eco impact of that is.
Right.
But I don't think the eco impact of massively consolidated cloud data centers is zero either. I did have an IBM colleague once who said, if God had meant us to do distributed processing, he would have put brains in our wrists. But then the same guy said, if God had meant us to use keyboards, he would have given us 112 fingers. So I'm not sure how reliable his views were.
Robin, that's been so useful. I think we've spent, the last several minutes talking about what closed platforms look like, which enable end-to-end encryption. But some of the largest platforms we have globally today are platforms like Instagram, Facebook, where the issues are a little different, and the sort of regulatory questions we're seeing thrown up by new legislation really tackles questions of what is safe harbor, what is the extent of liability of intermediaries, how do we think about content moderation in the context of online harms. And it sort of circles back to the point that you made right at the beginning, which is we don't want fragmentation of the internet. We want a seamless internet. So how do you look at these tensions that are emerging, and how does this sort of impact some of the larger principles of having an open interconnected internet?
Yeah. These are big ones as well. We're solving world poverty and hunger here. So some of those are of a scope that goes beyond what I think we can sensibly cover here, but they are on our radar. So, for example, intermediate liability, mandating open interfaces, some interesting and slightly worrying moves to try and remove encryption protections from some in the text of some trade agreements at the moment, which is a very strange development, and one that we're still trying to get our heads around. But as I say, those are huge topics in their own right. We did do some quite a substantial research project in response to a European initiative, for which the shorthand I would use is mandating open interfaces. So, with reasonable and rational intentions, the European Union was clearly thinking about some of these issues, particularly with proprietary platforms, and saying, actually, one of the ways to perhaps combat consolidation is to force platforms to publish an open interface, so that if someone does want to port their data to somewhere else, it may remove some of the obstacles they're doing so. And what we found was actually, for a start, it's not as simple once you open the covers. That's unsurprisingly. And really, the problem breaks down into two parts. There's how's your data structured and stored on that platform, and how's it used. And you can take someone's data out of the platform, but that doesn't in any way guarantee that they'll be able to use what they've been given. So, a really simple example would be, suppose you've got a button on Instagram. Like, I don't know what buttons are on there, but suppose you've got a button on there that says thumbs up, and you port your data out there, and you put it into another program that happens not to have a thumbs up button, or that it has a thumbs up button that you invoke some other way. Well, obviously, it's not going to be directly portable. When you look at an ecosystem like the whole family of Meta products, for example, they they collect and use so much data about you and your preferences and your settings and so on, that the idea that you could lift that out and put it somewhere else and it would all work perfectly is a bit like lifting a jellyfish out of a water tank and putting it on a lawn and expecting it to walk somewhere. It won't fit. It doesn't have the things around it that would allow it to function. And so pure data portability is not necessarily enough to guarantee interoperability or indeed portability of services as opposed to data. So I think when it comes to something like end-to-end encryption, you're then talking about a function set which is much more closely circumscribed. It's much more specific. You've got protocols for key exchange, you've got ways to handle metadata, and you've got transport of the encrypted content. So on the face of it, you're dealing with a much smaller set of functions for which to arrive at a mutually compatible interface. But even then, it can be very hard to achieve full interoperability. And a specific example of that was when there was a bit of tension between Signal and WhatsApp because of this proposal that they should make their products interoperable. And it had to do with how you handle messages that are in flight when the recipient has changed their device. So you send me a message. Before it reaches me, I accidentally I sit down on the toilet and my phone falls in, which has never happened to anyone, obviously. And so I need a new phone. But I haven't received your message yet. So what should we do with it? Should we simply throw it away? I mean, it's sitting there on the messaging server waiting to be delivered. But by the time I've got a new device, I initialize that device, I've now got a different personal key. And therefore, if you do deliver it, you're delivering it to someone who doesn't have the same personal key as the one they had when you sent it. So is it a good idea to send it, or should you discard it, or should you do something else? And one design team between Meta and Signal decided one way, to discard the message because it's not reliable, and the other team decided, actually, no, under those circumstances, it's okay to send it. They both had reasons for doing that. Their reasons were based on a particular security model. But if you ask them to interoperate, one of them is going to have to compromise on their security model. And therefore, for them, the interoperable product will be worse than the product that they designed. So you're asking them to make a difficult decision because they've made their design choices in good faith with the best interest at heart. So even in very specific cases like that, it can be hard to agree a mutually acceptable interoperable specification.
It sounds also like there might be like security concerns, like you're saying, like we did see with the IPA as well, in interoperable models, depending on how you make these decisions.
Right, because the signals that your data expects to receive as to what should be done with it, maybe you don't understand what those were in the, you see a parameter getting passed that says, if someone asks you for this data, return a value of 8. What does that mean? Does 8 mean never let this out of the building, or does 8 mean you can publish this to the world? I don't know, because I don't have sight of the internal workings of the platform it came from. So it's really hard. So as I say, there was a data model half of this. The other half of the research report, which is freely available, by the way, was about the state model that controls how that data is processed on a particular platform, and that's almost always going to be proprietary. And if it is not in the interest of the platform owner to open that up.
Thanks, Robin. That's been such an interesting conversation.
Likewise,
I think
not the easiest questions.
no, but
but
you
entirely
fielded them
welcome ones.
so well, and they are questions that are top of mind for academic researchers like us, working at CCG and engaging with the sort of changes that we are seeing, globally emerge. These are questions that we are all thinking about, and I'm sure these are questions that our audience is also thinking about as they read reporting around, the WhatsApp case before the Delhi High Court, as they look at global developments, across different continents around, encryption and its value, and the challenges that it seems to be posing for governments. So thank you so much for walking us through in a very, step by step, streamlined manner, the various issues that we need to be thinking about when we look at end-to-end encryption on platforms, and we really appreciate the time you spent with us today.
Oh, it's been a delight. Even when the questions were tough, I really enjoyed them, and I think they're the right questions and they're important ones. Um, I have a request.
Sure, we can stop the recording if.
Which you might edit or not edit.
Oh, sure.
I mentioned the conference that I was helping to organise in the first quarter of this year, and it's a conference on network and distributed system security. It happens every year. It has a number of co-located workshops, including workshops on, for example, usable security and privacy. And if you or your audience is doing research in those areas, we would love to hear about it. We'd love to see academic papers published. The conference has an open publications philosophy, and I would love to see more representation from India. There were some. There were a fair number of contributors from India, but I have to say the majority of them were students at US universities. And understandably, because it's a long way to travel, but we've got student support grants available. We would love to see greater representation from the Indian subcontinent as a whole on network security and privacy issues. So give that some thought. I'd love to see some proposals.
Thanks so much for letting us know about that opportunity, and to enable our audience to understand more about the opportunity, we'll be sure to add a link to maybe last year's conference in the show notes, so that they can browse and see if it's of interest, and hopefully you'll see a surge in applications from the Indian subcontinent for the next edition of the conference.
Great, that would be wonderful.
Great, thanks so much.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.